Thank you very much, Jim. You were very generous. I think you exaggerated. But, you know, there are some of us who are fools for flattery, and I appreciate it very much. And Mike Rollins, Mayor Rollins, you are everywhere. We certainly appreciate your being here tonight. And I always notice he's completely plugged in to every event that he attends. And it's extraordinary, and we all are grateful for the energy you put out in the job you hold. One more thing about Jim. There is no one who is better suited to chair the board of the 6th floor than Jim Hollyfield. I have to say, I think you share a couple of attributes of President Kennedy. You are grounded in history. You have a great sense of practical politics. And I think you can always rely on Jim Hollyfield for very astute analysis. Emotion is fine, but he admires the facts. And I think in an era short of facts, I appreciate that about you. I also want to say, you'll notice I'm matching the chair. Dr. Hollyfield is very perfectionistic, so I certainly got myself together for that. And he and Nicola Longford are well organized. You all notice you have cards in your chairs. We will ask you to pass them to the left, and they'll be collected at about 10 minutes before we wrap up tonight, and we'll have a chance to put your questions to Chris Matthews. We all know Chris Matthews, of course, from Hardball and from his Chris Matthews show on the weekend. There is nobody better suited than he is to talk about American politics, past or present. He has worked in politics himself. He worked as an aide to 4 members of Congress, including Senator Ed Muskie of Maine, who became Secretary of State for Jimmy Carter, you may recall. And Chris Matthews wrote speeches for Jimmy Carter as well. And he worked for Tip O'Neill, the great speaker, and his next book will be on Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan and their remarkable relationship. I look forward to reading that. He ran for Congress himself in Philadelphia, where he's from. That didn't work out. It should have. You would have been a great member. And he considered running for the Senate in 2008, and he would have been a great senator as well. But those of us who love American journalism are glad that you decided to stay there.
My wife's glad, too.
Of course, today is the primary here in Texas. We all await news of that. You can hear it on KERA FM once you leave the program tonight. Chris, you did a news special for MSNBC on the rise of the right. Not so long ago, a couple of years ago. And certainly the Tea Party is figuring in today's election. I think that's very clear. Some said it was waning, but we certainly saw its activities defeating Dick Lugar in Indiana, threatening Orrin Hatch in Utah. What do you think the influence of the right will be in this election by the time the year is over?
Well, it's tremendous. I think Orrin Hatch has a big challenge on his hands. In the primary coming up in Utah, he's been forced into a primary by about a point. He had to go into it. Facing a young man like he was back in '76. One of the races I was involved in was the '76 race out in Utah, when he came out of nowhere as a sort of a precursor of the Tea Party. And of course, Murdoch, as you mentioned, has knocked off Lugar in Indiana, and I think it's going to be tough to beat, even though I love this guy, Joe Donnelly, the Notre Dame guy, running against him. Not that I notice these things.
Well, you went to Holy Cross.
The tribe is somewhat relevant to me. But I'm not sure that they lose. I mean, I think a big mistake liberals and moderates make is when they think that if somebody from the right wins a primary, they're not going to win the general. I mean, everybody thought, we can't. George Herbert Walker Bush would be much tougher to beat than Reagan. And Reagan was a heck of a general election candidate. And Orrin Hatch was a general election candidate. So just because you go from the far right and you win a primary, I mean, Barbara Boxer keeps winning in California on the left. She never loses if she's on the left. She's not running for the middle. So sometimes people are taken with somebody of true belief. They prefer it to somebody who's trying to put the thing together politically. And so I wouldn't underestimate the chance of Cruz. I don't know, just reading the papers here today, Cruz is going to probably do well tonight, and who knows, beating Dewhurst. And that'll send a big message, especially probably going to win the general that way. It's a pretty conservative state now. And I'm looking at Rubio's now a mainstream candidate. He was considered a man of the right when he ran against Charlie Crist, right? He's now completely mainstream. So it's different, and so I think the Tea Party's got a lot of juice left and a lot of steam left in it, and I think they're going to do well. And I don't think they've lost yet at all. I think they're still going to control the House next year. They're going to control that poor guy, that speaker, who's always looked like he's in pain. I mean, it's too bad Jack Lemmon isn't around, because Jack Lemmon, in his later career, could have played this guy. He's always right on the verge of tears, and but likable as hell. But a guy you can completely see in his face. I mean, like Jack Lemmon, you You know the feelings that he's going. He has a great phrase for these Tea Party people, which he used in front of a Catholic group, which is so foul I can't repeat it here. So foul. So he doesn't mind saying what he thinks of these little, and then he has a word for it. And he's pretty much an amazing guy, so he's got to keep them going, but he's not one of them. I don't think Eric Cantor's one of them either. I think Eric Cantor knows which way the wind's blowing. He's sort of a young Dick Nixon. No, I mean that. Watch him. Watch Cantor. He's young Dick Nixon. He's aware of the wind direction. And if I were Boehner, I would sleep with a gun.
Well, if Boehner is to be played by Jack Lemmon, I guess if we're going to put together an odd couple, maybe Harry Reid is the other side of that, would you say? But
Harry Reid's much more dramatic fellow than he comes across on TV. Don't go by his TV image. He's a leader.
Yeah.
Look, he's a leader for a reason. He's good. He's tough. He's a tough Paul.
I heard a story on NPR.
Imagine imagine a liberal from Nevada these days. It's
That's
tough.
right. And a Mormon liberal. Isn't it interesting that we don't make anything of his being a Mormon?
Bring that up more often. That's fascinating. They never made an issue of Mo Udall's Mormonism, and
That's
they never
right.
made an issue of Frank Moss's. And I worked for Wayne Owens and they were all good guys. And it's something that historians will write about if he's elected as having had an influence on him. But for us in political discussions, it's indecent to talk about. It's one of those weird things. It will matter to history, probably in the way history's determined, if he's elected. They'll say, of course, there was a strong LDS impact on his thinking or whatever. But if you bring it up, you're creating a religious test, and I'm very wary of that. So.
Yeah, well, you make a lot of sense.
It's just, although, it's just one of those you can't talk about. Maybe you should, but you can't. And you can't because it's decency. Because everybody is born to their religion. Everybody likes to believe they thought of their religion and it was inspired, but 99% of the people in this room are the religion of their parents, and that's the way it is. And whether you're Jewish or Muslim or whatever you are, you're basically the religion of your parents. It's a heritage thing with you. And maybe you don't really believe it, but you go to church. And we're all living on so many levels of belief. We believe it in a way we don't believe it. In another way, intellectually we don't believe it, but emotionally we believe it. Or spiritually we need it, but we're on so many complicated levels, people, that you don't sit down to a person and say, do you really believe in God in a certain way? He's an old guy with a beard? No. So what do you believe? Then ask that question. You can't go to sleep with that one, because that's a hard one. Because that's hard intellectually. But emotionally and religiously, you are what you are in your religion, and you're loyal to it. And you go to church out of some kind of pre-belief, whatever you call it. And so I think it's unfair to say to a person, you're loyal to the religion of your parents. That's bad. To be loyal to the religion of your parents, that we consider that a value. And so to say he should put down Mormonism or examine it or defend it is not really fair, because you accept it, Yeah. You don't sit and argue about transubstantiation or the virgin birth or all that stuff, or exorcism. There's a good topic. But you accept it as your legacy of your parents.
Well,
if you ditch your parents' religion. No, I really think it's a hard thing to think through. There's a reason why we don't trash each other's religions, because we're trashing their heritages. We're trashing who they are, who their parents are, and I think that's why we don't like to do it.
Well, the religion of your parents was Roman Catholicism.
My father converted from Episcopalianism, and my grandmother was totally Presbyterian all her life. She was Mrs. Doubtfire. She was the real thing, Mrs. Doubtfire. She wasn't Robin Williams. She was Mrs. Doubtfire with the Irish accent. She was an orange woman to the day she died. So we had all three in our family. My grandfather's from England. My grandmother's from Northern Ireland. Very Protestant, very Episcopalian, very Presbyterian. The rest of the family's all Irish Catholic. So we're very Irish, but we're conflicted.
And of course, you were a Republican. Your family was Republican. Your mother sneaked in and voted for Kennedy in 1960.
We found that out just about a month
years
ago.
later.
A month ago, I found that out. My brother Jim said, Mom told me when she was ironing one time when she's looking at TV, and she said, I voted for that guy, but don't tell your father he'd kill me.
But you were drawn to JFK because, in a way, you felt that he would bring the Irish Catholic community into the mainstream.
No.
No?
I was drawn to him because I find him fascinated. I was fascinated by the guy. I thought he was the most interesting guy. I don't know about you, but there's three people I will read anything about if I pick up a magazine or newspaper. Hemingway, I'll read anything that says the word Hemingway. I will read anything about him. And Churchill, anything about him. I'll pick up a magazine and I will read that book and that article, and I'll probably read the book. and the third's Jack Kennedy. And I can only say that I'm intrigued by the guy. I'm really intrigued by him. I find him elusive. And, so,
well, after the assassination.
and by the way, you will find him elusive. I know you read the book, but I'll tell you, what really gets to you, the mysteries about the guy, his feelings towards Jackie, the stuff you really have to fight to get to, his loyalty to his friends and what it was all about, his impulsive grace with burning gasoline all around to dive into the the Pacific Ocean and save the lives of those crewmen instinctively. This guy whose life had been a life of pleasure, what made him make that incredible decision to carry that guy on his back for 4 hours when his own back was practically broken? How did he swim that hard? How could he pull that guy? Why did he say, I'm going to save this one guy's life? I'm going to make this other guy who wants to quit. I'm going to save his life. What made him look out for his crew the way he did in a chilling, incredibly heroic way? What got him through the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is till this day the most frightening moment of our life? Anybody my age knows what I'm talking about, the most frightening close call we ever had. And only he, thank God there was no Nixon there. And I'm not a Nixon hater. Thank God there was no Cheney there. I mean, that we had somebody who could see through this thing, and not as a macho man test, but as a real possibility of nuclear war. It was right there, the chain reaction. And thank God he'd read Barbara Tuchman. Thank God he understood how chain reactions occur. And he had a sense of deep history, that he knew the deal had to be struck behind the scenes with the Russians over Turkey. Some deal had to be struck. So he was both Churchill and Chamberlain. He had to put it all together to save us from that. Half the world being killed and the rest of us looking like we've been killed, and the whole face of the planet different than it would be today, just because of him. And LeMay wasn't helping him. George Bundy, his Harvard dean, genius, national security advisor, wasn't with him. Dean Acheson, the great man of the Cold War, wasn't with him. He had to fight all those guys, in fact, all the Joint Chiefs he had to fight. And he had to find his way past the Politburo to Khrushchev so he could find this human being on the other side he could cut a deal with. How did he do it in the space of a week or two? And he had Bobby. Half the answer is he had this incredibly tough brother who was there to back him up against all this pressure from the right and left. Powerful stuff.
Well, I certainly
And that's why he's elusive. I'm sorry.
Would you like to go on?
No. Yes.
Do if you want to.
It is a hard job you've taken, but you've taken it. You've taken this job. It's a hard job, Lee. It demands a keen mind.
Well, I am glad that JFK read The Guns of August by Tuchman. It's an extraordinary book. And I would suggest, and I really got this from reading your book, that his heroism in every one of these instances can be traced to his love of history. Right after the assassination here in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, Jackie Kennedy, and I'm quoting you, citing your last chapter, or next to last chapter, summoned Teddy White, the great journalist, to Hyannisport, and gave him a 4-hour interview in which she said, history made Jack, this sick, lonely boy reading history. How do you think history affected his presidency itself?
I think he, by the time he was 5 or so, he was reading King Arthur and Ivanhoe and all this stuff that good parents lead their good kids to read. And he's reading Churchill. He read the history of World War I by Churchill when he was 14, the whole book. He was reading the New York Times every day and studying it and distilling it out and lying in his bed trying to think through the main parts of the articles. And he did study history, and I think he understood how wars start, and I think he knew what great leaders were. He knew that nations were moved by great leaders like Churchill, and that countries were at stake. Whole countries were at stake. And he saw that in London during the war, that if they had the wrong prime minister, they would have been in bed with Hitler. And it was that close, because Halifax wanted to cut a deal, give away Gibraltar, give him some African territories, anything. He wanted to cut the deal through Mussolini. Churchill said, no, we're not going to do that. And Churchill said, we're going to fight on even if we lose in Dunkirk. And Churchill made the difference in the 20th. He just said, we're not going to go the easy. Maybe he was wrong, but he turned the course of history against the Nazis. He did it.
And of course, the one who didn't want to go to war with the Nazis was Jack Kennedy's father, Ambassador Joe P. Kennedy Jr., who was in London, and they were glad when he left. Jack Kennedy did an interesting thing.
I was with the American ambassador recently. He said it's still there, that legacy. It still sits over there. That memory of him.
Oh, yeah. He wrote a book, actually he wrote a senior thesis called Appeasement in Munich, and then it became a book called Why England Slept. And he took issue with his father in a very subtle way. said, now the reason England didn't want to fight for the Sudetenland was it had not rearmed after World War I. It was in no position to fight, and the U.S. must not make the same position. Did his father accept this? And
his father, I'm not sure, grasped it. His father, Jack, had done an end run on the old man and basically said the old man was wrong to say that Hitler shouldn't have been confronted. But I'm not sure he got it because he defended technically the decision at Munich not to fight because they weren't ready. But morally, he said they should have been ready. And I think he missed that other point. And of course, the old man was just supportive of the kids. But the old man was not a good guy about that. He maybe wasn't a good guy, period. But he had no problem with the Nazis. And in fact, one of the great things I came across is a classmate of Joe Kennedy Jr., who was an America Firster and very much the old man's son. They bumped into each other down at Jacksonville. They were Choate classmates. I believe they were classmates. And he said, "What are you up to?" He said, "I'm down here studying flight training. I'm going to go over and kill Nazis. I'm going to get them in their bullpen." Now, maybe his memory was too good. Maybe he filled it in later. But it was so heroic to me and wonderful and inspiring to know that young Joe Kennedy, as much as he was a conservative like his father, saw the evil for what it was and was willing to go over and give his life, really, to go all the way to get the V3 sites. I mean, it's an amazing story of having an older brother that was killed on a suicide mission when his plane blew up over the channel. And to have that as your brother who had been against the war. And that it's an incredible thing in the Kennedy family. And then young Bobby went off and joined the service. And Jack went off and asked for combat duty at the front. He could have been in the intelligence service the whole time. They wanted to go out and fight for their country. They wanted to be in it. And it's pretty heroic. And I think that had a lot to do with how this country changed in the 40s between a country that was basically Protestant, and that was it, to a country that was much bigger than that. A lot of Jewish people fought in that war. I mean, tens of thousands, and that's where some of the best writing came out of that war. You know, these guys like Norman Mailer were on this war. I mean, it was an amazingly general war, and everybody was in it, and not like today. And it wasn't a class thing. The elite were fighting at the front. Harvard, if you ever go to the Memorial Chapel, has a whole wall, this gigantic wall, the chapel, of people killed in World War II. These are the elite. And how many people went to college in the 30s? These guys went to college in the 30s. These men, all killed. So it was a war fought by the elite like World War I was in Britain. And it was pretty stirring that way. They had guys like George Herbert Walker Bush over there, you know, getting shot down a couple times. And George Shultz. And John Mitchell
and Richard
in the PT
Nixon.
service, and Nixon was over there in Bougainville. In fact, Nixon was a very popular officer. He was a kind of a Mr. Roberts type. The men really liked him.
And he made a lot of money playing poker.
He played poker a lot of guys. And Nixon would have been a much better man if he'd just taken the defeat in '60 and had really lived an amazing life. But as I talked to him, his son-in-law said, I said, suppose he had it all over to do again and just had quit back in '60. He'd have to go through impeachment and all that stuff. He said, no, he liked it all. Nixon liked it as a piece. He wanted the whole thing. He wouldn't have ever been happy to just duck out around when he was still pretty popular. Living up in New York at a great law firm with a good life, going to the opera and hanging out with Tom Dewey and being a big shot in New York and living very well as a law practitioner, and he just couldn't stand that. He had to get back in the action. Complicated guy, I mean, obviously.
You mentioned Joe Jr., and of course he was the golden boy of the family. Jack was the second son, not much loved by his mother, as Jackie Kennedy pointed out.
Gene told me that, and Gene denies that. Gene told me after I wrote in the book that his mother never loved him because Jackie, I quoted Jackie saying his mother never loved him a couple times in that interview. She said, and then I got another classmate who said they never visited, you know.
When he was ill at Choate.
Thought he had leukemia and the mother never showed up. But she said she was too busy with Rosemary. So.
Who was, had
mental problems.
Retardation, yes. Mm-hmm. And, but you made a very keen insight, it seemed to me, reached a keen insight that hadn't occurred to me. And it's that Jack Kennedy was alone so much in infirmaries, in hospitals, that he couldn't bear to be alone as an adult. He had to have people with him all the time, and new people, as you said, new attention.
Fresh company.
New attention, all the time.
We used to call it strange back in the 60s. Shouldn't have said that. Yeah, he liked fresh company. He liked the new arrivals. He didn't like he had best friends like Chuck Spaulding, and Spaulding would say after a couple of days he'd pretty much had it with you. And Jackie, for example, they went on their honeymoon, and here he is marrying one of the most beautiful women in the world, and very cultivated, and obviously in very ways the most supportive person in the world. And they get down to Acapulco, and Jack gets bored with the honeymoon and heads up the coast and hangs out with his buddy in San Francisco and goes to a football game and dumps her on Anita, Red-Faced wife. And as Red-Faced says, I guess Jack thought it was normal. I just got tired of her. I mean, whatever going on in the guy's life, he just got tired of people, and he would behave like this. And Jackie, you know, as she said, I was kind of a Victorian wife. In fact, she said I was even Asiatic. He was just put up with it. And he had this thing about friends, and every time he would, I mean, I'm not good at planning my weekends. To me, I'm like Saturday morning, I'm exhausted, probably like you. I mean, like we all do. We spend the week, we work our butts off, and then Saturday morning, you don't have to get up quite as early, but you're thrilled you don't have to do anything. You haven't planned anything. Jack planned every weekend. This weekend he'd say, well, Len Billings has got to show up, his buddy from school, or Chuck Spaulding's got to be there this weekend, or Ben Brownlee has got to show up with Tony. He'd always planned to have other people there with Jackie. He never wanted to face a weekend alone with Jackie. I figured that out. He never wanted to have dinner alone with her. He always had couples over. So his idea of a good time was company. He liked company. And so, and maybe these relationships were also couples, so that he could establish a couple relationship with another couple. Meanwhile, he had this whole other life he was leading with the girls, and he's girling, as he called it. And he had that other compartment out there. So he had so many compartments, the Irish. And Jackie knew about the Irish mafia here, and the WASPy friends are all second and third generation wealth, old money, which are the only friends he had. The elite academics like Arthur Schlesinger and Bundy and Galbraith. And they were over here, and they were all in their different compartments, and they were all sealed off against each other. Nobody really met each other or liked each other. And Jackie knew he moved among these compartments, and she was in one big one. He was really married to her. They had a real marriage. I mean, you listen to her tapes with Schlesinger, and they're real. She wasn't just arm candy. She was a wife. They talked about everything. She knew about the Onions Burke fight. She knew about all the old politics they'd been through. She had been through all the turmoils a spouse shares with it, if you have a good marriage, which they did. Except that other things were going on too. It's just a fact. Yeah. And live with it or whatever. Bunny Mellon told me. I said, how did you know Jackie knew all about these relationships? And they didn't put it in the book, but Bunny is my neighbor in Nantucket, so I'm very proud.
And a friend of John Edwards.
Said, yeah, true. But
he's the one who sent the money.
I think our relationship's a little more circumscribed. But Bunny said, I said, how'd she know? She knew it all. And she said, she told me. And they'd spent a lot of time up on the dunes, up in Nantucket together. And it wasn't a secret. It was an open world to Jack, the way he lived. And it's an interesting relationship. Then he had serious relationships, like with Mary Meyer, which are fascinating to me. I'd love to know more about those relationships. And then the tawdry ones, like Fiddle and Faddle in the Office. And
Judith Campbell,
who was a Jackie lookalike.
Mafia mall, in the mall of the mafia
with
guy.
Giancana's girlfriend, and she was a Jackie lookalike. And who the other one was, I found, Mimi Fonstock, who I knew. Gorgeous person. I knew her when she was about 30. I never knew about this relationship, but she was so elite, and she was so refined and perfect in every way, and she was old money, I guess, and that relationship was going on when she was 19. That's in that book that came out. I don't know why she wrote that book, but geez, I would never have written it.
Well, you mentioned Jackie Kennedy's interview with Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and this was just a few years after the assassination. It's just been released in book form and on tape, and I'm puzzled by a couple of things. In those tapes, she said, number one, Martin Luther King Jr. was a fraud. That puzzled me, that she would say it. And number two, that the reason the Kennedy brothers went for LBJ on the ticket is they wanted him out of the Senate. Of course, they wanted to carry Texas, too, and they did with the tombstone votes in Duval County. But I'm puzzled why
I think she's in over her head in these conversations.
Why did she say this?
She didn't know what she's talking about. I mean, this isn't what, maybe it's something she overheard. It's like listening to Evelyn Lincoln. Don't believe a word of it. Not a word of it. It's how reporters get in trouble with this oral history thing. The trouble with oral history is it's indiscriminate. You got to at some point make a judgment about who you think knows what they're talking about. Study the facts, get the record straight, and then build from that, not from the oral history. And there's some of these things are just unsubstantiated. Jack didn't know he could get Johnson to be his running mate. The minute he knew he could get him, he grabbed him, he reached for it. He knew he needed the South. He wasn't going to get Texas without Johnson. It would have been such a hard reach for him to get Texas without Johnson, without...
And it was just barely.
Just barely. Even then you don't know it's clean.
It wasn't.
So you have LBJ working the hustings and pulling in all the vote that's out there in this one-party state, which it was then. There was no poll watching. And he was able to bring in the votes. And he used to call them landslide. But, I mean, I think that, and the idea of KERA is completely wrong in this new book about him dumping him. Sorensen, which KERA points out, changed his tune. No, KERA, in his latest book, Counselor, Ted Sorensen, who was the most honest man I've ever come across, said he was going to keep him on the ticket. The planning right up to the end at Palm Beach when they were all, Kenny O'Donnell were putting this all together, Johnson was there. He was with Kennedy at the week here in November. The whole thing was about appearing with Johnson, partnering with him publicly. The idea that he would dump him is outrageous, absurd. How would he have? Kennedy needed Texas. He had already lost. Look at the states he had lost. At gunpoint, they integrated the University of Ole Miss. Gunpoint. Federal troops. They had to go in and basically...
That was James Meredith.
Yeah, they had a Bigfoot, the National Guard, the state police, the governor, and everybody, Ross Barnett, and the people, the white people. They had to go in on top of them. You think that was the state he was going to carry? Alabama, he'd gone there and got Nick Katzenbach and a very tall head of the National Guard to push Wallace out of the way. And luckily there they integrated Vivian Malone, whose sister Sharon sat next to me at dinner a couple months ago, and her husband just happens to be Attorney General. So there's progress being made here, to say the least. Vivian and Sharon have a history to tell. And he wasn't going to get Alabama, he wasn't going to get Mississippi. He probably wasn't going to get Carolinas again, South Carolina especially. So what's he going to get? He was hoping for Texas and Georgia. And maybe he could have held on to North Carolina. He wasn't going to get Florida and Virginia either because they were Republican. So he needed those states. And he was going to pick up California. I mean, KERA's right about that. But he damn well wasn't going to put Pat Brown on the ticket, which KERA writes, which is insane. He's 2 Catholics. What are you, crazy? 2 Irish Catholics. Let's double it down on the Irish Catholics. We got in the door. Let's open it up. It's a club now. Yeah, right. You know, doesn't anybody pay attention to this stuff?
Well, speaking of...
How did KERA say 2 mix? So this is a really smart move. Let's go with it. We got it now.
The New York Times had a story May the 6th about the 9 toss-up states. This would be New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Florida, Iowa, Ohio, Wisconsin, Colorado, Nevada. All of them carried by Obama in 2008. And in many of them, 7 of them now have Republican governors. The Republican registration has grown. The Democrats don't have the same advantage in registration that they had 4 years ago. What do you see ahead in these states?
I would not trust the polls. I would want the polls to be better than 3 or 4 points for Obama to win. I'd want to see him right at the edge of the margin of error for him to win. I think that some white voters are going to give the politically correct answer this time. Last time around, they were embarrassed about voting for him. I think their husbands or wives. A lot of people, he beat the spread last time. He beat the polling. Because I think a lot of white people did something that they didn't really want to advertise at home, which was, to me, wonderful. But the normal practice is people say what they think is the politically correct answer. I'm convinced that polling is not reliable in matters of ethnicity and gender. I think people they give the answer that very well turned out pollster wants to hear. You know, people don't call up with a nice regional accent. They call it with perfect New York Times English. How would you be voting in the election? They know that pollster's a liberal. They're not going to give the right answer. So they're going to give the right answer. I don't believe a word of it. I want to know how they vote on election day. Every time they poll on same-sex, all the polling says we're all for it, right? 32-0. Every time a state votes on it. Every single time they vote it down. There's no doubt, and they doubt 70% down in states like Missouri. And then they get in the poll and they get so many polls. Oh, yeah, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, sure. Get them in the booth. And they can do what they feel like doing. And the older voter, which is the dominant voter, votes his or her way. And the Christian people and the people we hear from the pastors, that's all going to be out there. And the African-American pastors, same deal. It's going to be a tough one this time around, North Carolina. It's going to be tough. This was a monkey wrench thrown into this election. We don't know. It's not going to help. Because it's going to make people vote for a simultaneous equation. I like Obama and I like same-sex. Well, that's 2 things. They're not really related. They're not really related. I like Obama and I may not like that, but you're asking to vote for both. And that's harder. That's why local politicians don't get involved in national politics if they can avoid it. They don't want to set a higher bar for voting for the guy. I like him because he looks out for us at home. Fine. Don't complicate it with national issues. That's why they don't like to go on television. And you don't see many people. The same 20 people are on television all the time. Most Congress people are smart enough to stay home and work the district. Serving you since 1910, you know, and those things. That's what they want. They don't want to disagree with you on same-sex and, you know, whatever. Where do you stand on this? Where do you stand on that? But sooner or later they're going to find something you don't agree with them on. How about gay bishops? Well, I don't know. Okay, you're going. You know, it's very tricky. It's very tricky. So most politicians don't tell you where they stand on every issue, so you can pick out the ones you don't like. They cool it. So that's my theory. So back to my point, it's going to be tough for Obama. And I think if the economy would pick up a little bit, it would uptick a bit in the next quarter. Let's see, we're into January, February, March, April, May, June. Well, we're getting into the second quarter. It's not happening. July, August, September, he better get something going. So this third quarter, he's got to get some juice. And I don't think business is helping him. I think a lot of these guys are sitting on their trillions, loving it. I don't trust American business to be the cavalry to save Obama. All right? Because I think they're quite happy to sit on their money and, oh, too bad. The minute Romney gets in there, they'll be spending like crazy people to make them look good. I know they won't do it. They're not prejudiced. I understand. But
it's time to hand your cards to your left, and people will collect them. But speaking of political money, I heard a story on NPR just last week about the super PACs. And from what I was hearing, millions upon millions will be spent in the election this fall. Yeah. And a lot of it.
Out of here.
No, out of here. They're all here raising money. We don't get the ugly.
No, around this area. Yeah, you got.
That's what I mean.
Harold
Simmons has given $18 million thus far.
Bob Perry and all these guys.
That's right. But with the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of this money is going into the super PACs. Moreover, the consultants, or so I heard, would prefer to work for the super PACs because you don't have to put up with the candidate or the candidate's spouse. You don't have to crisscross the country. And it seems to me it's going to change politics in a way.
Yeah, Larry McCarthy, who did Willie Horton is back. He's working for Crossroads. He's working for Karl Rove. There's a marriage made in heaven. Larry McCarthy, a Willie Horton fan, now joins the Karl Rove team. They're together. And you have these people back. You're right. I never heard it put so well, that the idea they get to work for just sheer haters. It keeps it simple. Yeah. We hate this guy, let's use him again.
To a moment where the personalities will not matter. You will have the business group, and they were very clear about this. They're not interested in social issues. They're interested in government issues.
Like lower taxes, less regulation, whatever else they want.
Precisely.
They should be able to write it off, I'd say. Go all the way with it, because it's all business expense.
Exactly.
These guys are making money off of an election bet. And the great irony is that should probably be a tax write-off.
Well,
because they benefit financially by the election of a Romney. They made it clear. But I don't want to be partisan about this. I mean, I don't like secret money, no matter who's spending it. I thought we had some real reforms after Watergate that were really good, limiting us to something that the average, at least better off person can afford, $2,300 for a candidate. And you can imagine giving a couple $1,000 to a politician. Nobody can imagine giving millions. And for these guys, it's chump change. It doesn't mean anything to them to buy. Herb Adelson will have billions to spend. And just try to do the ratios in your own life. If you had $1 billion, say you have a net worth of 10 million, and this guy's got $1 billion. Well, let's think what different ratio they live at. It's an extraordinary amount of money, and these ads work. I've been traveling around Iowa and New Hampshire and Florida. I'm going to tell you, when you can't turn on Entertainment Tonight, you can't escape it. Wherever you go, these saturation, negative ads are running relentlessly. It destroyed, whatever you think of these people, it destroyed Newt, destroyed Santorum.
Destroyed Rick Perry?
All that they had to do is, people didn't exactly vote for Mitt Romney. I'm not knocking him right now, but they didn't vote for him. They voted against these other guys, almost like roller derby. And he survived, because everybody else was knocked off the course with tremendous negative saturation advertising. And if you're just a regular voter and you don't think much about it, you just read the paper once or twice a week, and maybe you just don't know Santorum, you're not going to like him. And you're not going to like Newt. You're not going to like any of these people. Perry, once these ad campaigns are finished with them. I said it was like Dresden, absolute firebombing. And if that's the way you like your politics, fine, but you're going to end up with who's still alive, not who people chose. And this is going to be rough.
Let me ask you another question, going back to JFK. Bill Clinton reviewed the KERA book and said something interesting to me. He said that the presidency released Lyndon Johnson in this way. It freed him to embrace his past. He had tried to avoid associating himself with his past, which involved poverty and a lot of deprivation, and all of a sudden he could embrace that. And it brought out his humanity, and it affected his legislation. How do you think, did you think that the presidency released Kennedy in some similar way?
Well, he'd led a really privileged life up until West Virginia. And I think people around him said that he'd never seen it. He'd never seen people that were just overlooked, living out in the nowhere. But I'm sure that he'd been past, bad neighborhoods. Poor people weren't well off, everybody. He certainly knew that. But I'd like to think that politics is a great education. I mean, Arthur Schlesinger said politics is essentially an educational career. You're constantly learning, like a good dentist or a good doctor. You're constantly, but your manuals are the people, unlike a doctor. You're not just reading the manuals or reading the journals. You are constantly coming in contact with people's problems. And I think that even Pat Buchanan came out of that race very much concerned about working people and what globalization was doing to them. And I get along with Pat, and he came out of there with all these guys that lost their jobs in industry because of trade with China and stuff like that, and the Pitchfork Brigade was filled with those people. And I think he learned a lot. He became very radicalized. He's not a regular Republican, Pat Buchanan.
Well, we know that.
No, he's not. Yeah, but I would invite him to any setting like this group, because you would find his thinking. I know he gets into tribalism, which gets him in trouble and cost him his job, but get off the tribalism stuff, and he's amazing. I mean, he really does think about things. But it's hard to forget about the tribalism. It's sort of part of him.
Well,
he wants America to be like it was in 1953. I mean, like America was in 1953. Now, there were certain nice parts of it, and there were other parts that weren't very nice, especially for people that didn't look just like Pat. So,
right.
I mean, it was rough, and it was brutal, but I know what he meant. His halcyon days were when he was the tough guy getting in fights in Chevy Chase. Tough neighborhood.
I thought that the most important thing you said about John Kennedy in your book, The Elusive Hero, was this. You said, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, that he grasped the times and was able to wield that understanding. But that you referred to Curtis LeMay and others, Douglas Dillon, all those who wanted to strike Cuba. We must strike right now. MacArthur, you said, wanted his soldiers to carry nuclear weapons in their holsters to fire on sight.
I got it out of the tapes. I mean, I don't know how everybody ignores the history.
But Kennedy understood that the times were fundamentally different from when LeMay led his wing in the Strategic Air Command.
But that was a great example where he was taught by a guy he looked up to. Doug MacArthur came to see him in his dotage. He was 82 at the time. He came to see him in the White, and Kennedy gave him like 45 minutes. It's just last night. And all that MacArthur was doing is saying, what we ought to do is give our soldiers nuclear sidearms. And the reason is because they had been overrun. Was it the 8th Army? Which one of the Army was it? 7th, whatever it was in Korea, had been overrun on the peninsula. And by the Chinese hordes, if you will. They just come even without guns. There was millions of people just overwhelmed them. And he said this would give our soldiers a psychological advantage, having a nuclear weapon. And Kennedy, way of sort of nurturing or babying me, he says, you mean they would just shoot it like 20 yards in front of them and would just go up in a puff? I mean, like, he understood there was fallout. You don't like shoot a nuclear weapon, it just blows up there and you're part of it, It's not like it doesn't go in a direction like a ray gun, it just blows up. And he understood that, but MacArthur didn't. He thought it'd be like a ray gun of something. He didn't know what a nuclear weapon was. He just knew he was outnumbered in the Korean War, after he thought he'd won it after Incheon, and he thought he could do this. I mean, and Kennedy just nicely sits and the only reason you find these things is they're in the tapes, and you go dig this stuff up, and that's what's so great about that kind of history, recorded history. It's better than oral history. You get the tapes, you find out what actually happened to me, then you can type it out. And you got history.
Back to Joe Kennedy for a moment. He controlled the money, even in JFK's Senate office when the money was government money. His father dictated how it was to be spent, except in the case of Sorensen. JFK hired Sorensen on his own.
He wouldn't let him pay a good salary.
It sounds like FDR.
He wouldn't give a good salary to his secretary team, his management team in the office. He kept screwing them and squeezing them, and they finally walked. Mary Davis just walked on and said, I've had enough of this.
But it's like FDR, his mother controlled the money until almost the end of his presidency, when she finally couldn't draw another breath.
I didn't know that.
She did. So what did this must have, actually, that's why I think Jackie married Onassis, was to get away from Joe Kennedy and his control of the money.
Yeah, I think that was a a la carte relationship.
Could be.
It wasn't the American plan.
Okay. One of the most wonderful things you dug up, and while you answer, I'll read your questions. I didn't know this, but you dug it up. There was a headmaster at Choate named George St. John who gave chapel all the time and was fond of saying to these young men, and they were all men in those days, you must be loyal to your college. Ask not what she can do for you, ask what you can do for her. So
in direct quotes in his Bible, in his sermon notes, with a big quote, direct quote with a capital. Ask not what you can do for your what you can do for her, but what she can do for you. And pretty amazing how
you
that
can
popped
incorporate
back.
that at SMU, Jen.
How that popped back into history there from Jack.
Yeah,
and,
so my fellow Americans and so forth.
Sorensen thought it might be from there, and then he never went up there and did what I did, was go up there and go in the archives and dig it out and find it in a binder and open up the binder, and there it is. I mean, a lot of journalism, anybody here who's a journalist knows that the key, as you know, is to go there.
Oh, yeah.
And you don't get it on the phone. I tell my kids, you think you're going to get a job on the phone or with email? No, you're not going to get a job. You got to go there. You got to stand in front of them and ask for the job, not for the decision. Ask for the job, and you have to do it. Woody Allen was right. 80% of life is showing up, and I think that everything I've ever been able to get, I got by showing up. Most of it.
Here's a question from our audience: could JFK be elected today?
In a close election, I think the Addison's disease might have stopped, would probably have stopped him, and all the steroids he was taking. And he probably would have stopped taking them for a while to be able to say he wasn't taking them, I guess. But he was taking steroids, and he did have Addison's disease. And I don't know whether the press would have not jumped when Indian Edwards and LBJ dropped that story. Not LBJ, John Connolly dropped that story in Los Angeles. But then again, Kennedy had an almost classic appeal. I mean, like Bogart does. You can see a Bogart movie today and it works. Just works. It's totally today. But I think Kennedy had that appeal. Just it works all the time. That's what classic means. It lasts. It endures through time. And I think he had that kind of appeal. I just think his wit was dry and real. It wasn't phony, knee-slapping humor, which isn't really funny. You know when like when Romney tells a joke. I mean, it's not coming from inside. It's not a delightful way of looking at life that you're benefiting from. It's just some joke somebody gave him. But like Mondale was like that. Where's the beef? He had to rehearse it with the guy. He didn't know what "where's the beef" meant. He had no idea what the whole idea meant, but he was taught how to do it, These guys, a lot of them are just androids politically. They just have to be taught everything. They don't know. They spend all their time thinking about their ambition, not about anything else. They don't have any side vision. They don't pay attention to anything outside the vision. It doesn't relate to what they want. Walking agenda wasps. And they walk around like this. I must have this. I must get here. This will get me from here to there and there to here. Everything is this organization of their lives. They're not very interesting people that way. They're just driven by this obsession with getting elected. They don't have time for anything else. My boss, Tip O'Neill, is a wonderful guy. He never went to the movies. As his kid said, he couldn't talk. He could just sit there and watch. Why would he want to sit and watch a movie? Because it didn't relate to what he wanted to do, which was to be in the action or whatever. Just some people don't read anything that doesn't relate to their work. That makes them really neat.
Regarding what you say about the elusive style of Kennedy, what in your gut do you think he would have done about Vietnam?
Well, I think that's not too elusive. I think he wanted to, he never committed a combat troop into combat as president. He was very careful about limiting our engagement to advisors. And the combat troops came in. Just remember, in '65, LBJ had to make the decision, so that's when he would have been forced to make the decision, when it was clear that the government was falling there. And then you had to make a decision whether you're going to commit to a large air war. And the only way to do a large air war was to base the planes on the ground, which meant you had to protect the bases. And the only way to protect the bases, we can't have just guards walking around like this; they'll be rocketed to death. You have to have an aggressive ground operation. So it all mounts on the top. So if you want to win an air war, then you have to have bases, and to have bases, you have to have infantry that are willing to clear large areas around the base, or eventually all your planes will be blown up by mortar fire. Just gone. They'll all be gone. Every night, the sun comes down, planes are all blown up. So the only way to stop that was a combat commitment. And then, of course, once we got into the combat commitment, it grew really exponentially. Would Kennedy have done that? I don't think so. I think Kennedy saw what happened with the French. He knew it was a nationalistic war at some level. I think he would have known, he began to know he was going to have to cut the best deal he could. Just based on his sense of history, especially in Vietnam. So I would like to think that he was going to cut a deal at some point. But I don't know whether he could have done it in 64. He might not have had to choose. His point of decision would have been 65. That was the tough one. And would he have accepted the fact that he would have to do a coalition-style government like they did in Laos? I'd say yeah. He would have gone for a papered-over political solution, which was not really a victory. But I just don't. If Ho Chi Minh would have accepted it, a coalition government. If we left all our troops out, if we hadn't put all the troops in, we said we're taking them out, I think he would have accepted it. But just remember, the deal was always going to be we have to leave. That was our deal in Vietnam, and that's why Johnson and Nixon could never cut the deal, because the deal was we leave. And Nixon could have had that deal in 69 in January if he was willing to pull out. He ended up getting the deal in 73, pulling out. It's a sad reality, but they're going to stay and we're going to leave. And that's why I'm always against these wars, because I know in the end, the people that stay run the show and the people that leave don't. And so unless you're willing to stay like the British permanently and build an India, which they're willing to do, and it worked. You're willing to stay long enough to create a democracy, hundreds of years. You're willing to really put everything you have in it for generations of commitment and people moving there and infiltrating the country culturally. And nobody is going to move to Afghanistan. No American wants to live there. These guys are doing their duty and they're doing it courageously, but we're not going to go there and stay. We Americans can't wait to get home. We like it here. We don't want to go live anywhere else. The Brits like to go somewhere else. In Lawrence of Arabia, they said you love remote places, desolate places. Yeah, they do. And we're waiting for the next movie, then we're waiting to come home. The Brits can't wait to bring Gilbert and Sullivan to the natives. And we're just not interested. We like it. We don't live on some little island. We like it here. And I just think we're never going to succeed in the long run. So we have to always do a quickie in and out and say, if we can do it and get the hell out of there, fine. But the idea of changing countries, I just think I just don't know what we're talking about. I just don't know. I know why we went chasing after bin Laden, but why we stayed for 10 years and why we stayed in Iraq all these years. I think it's Cheney stuff. I mean, it's just this, we got to boss people around stuff. We got to inflict our will on people. I think it's Cheneyism. And it's the neocons. That's my last speech.
One last question about Kennedy. Today, of course, would have been his 95th birthday if he had lived. I was quite struck in your book by how desperate his health situation was becoming. I didn't realize he was on crutches in private in those last months, not in front of the world. It was like FDR.
Yeah.
I mean, he had the terrible surgery in the early 50s, too, so he wouldn't have to be in a wheelchair. It looks to me as if he was on his way to a wheelchair.
Yeah, Taz Shepard lied to me. I mean, his top military guy is naval attaché, a really fine guy. I interviewed him a couple of years ago, and I said, well, how about Kennedy in crutches? Never saw him in crutches.
Yeah.
Plenty of pictures of him on crutches. And in fact, he was on a big forklift to put him on the plane. He couldn't get on the airplane. He couldn't walk up the steps of Air Force One.
Like FDR.
He was getting 6 shots of Provocaine a day in his back, I think. I mean, there was horrible pain he was in all the time. He couldn't pick up a golf club. He couldn't pick up a kid. You never see him really playing touch football. He's usually quarterbacking. You never see him running. The guy had so many health problems. The back was butchered and it was bad. Congenitally, one of his legs was 3/4 of an inch shorter than the others. You'd think the doctors would have noticed that. That was a little fact they overlooked. That one leg was shorter than the other. That had something to do with his congenital problem. When he went in the Navy, he had to fake his way in. He got help from his dad's attaché over in London that got him in. He shouldn't have passed muster. His father was scared to death he was going to be on this bucking Bronco. You know when you're in a speedboat, how it bucks. Well, a cigarette boat like the Bushes. This is a boat that just bucked, and his back is killing him. Every night he had to sleep on a board, a piece of plywood, or a table. He could never sleep on a bed his whole life. He always had a corset, a big girdle he wore. And he had it all zipped up. There's a couple pictures of him you see. In the Navy, he was running around with a sacroiliac bag, trying to get some scissors, there's some thread and needle because he had to fix it. He was always in this kind of situation. the leukemia, he thought it was leukemia. He was getting turned upside down, looked into, going to hospital after hospital. If you go through the records, he was like every February, it seemed, or January, he'd be away at Mayo or up at Chelsea or at Boston at Brigham's. He was always in the hospital. He had the record, I think, for time in the infirmary at Choate. He was always sick. It had to do with his blood count, all the time being checked. And this went on and on and on. And in 50, he had the last rites in 47 for Addison's disease. I didn't mention Addison's disease. The last rites in 47. It was with Pamela Harriman. The doctor said, this guy's not going to live a year. He had the last rites again in 51. He was with Bobby, saved his life over and got him to a military hospital in Okinawa. They were on a trip together. Saved his life. That's when he really got to know the power of his brother's loyalty. The last rites again in 1954. Nixon was crying in the car because I talked to the Secret Service agent who was with Nixon. Nixon was crying. Thought Kennedy was gone. And I mean, imagine having the last rites 3 times in your life. Nobody has it 3 times in life.
So if he hadn't been assassinated in Dallas, the Kennedys don't live very long. Jackie died at age 64. Bobby assassinated at 42. Teddy Kennedy, early 70s. How long do you think JFK would have had a chance to live?
I think he had real problems.
He feared that he would have a short life. That's
what a lot of his carpe diem attitude about life was because of that. He would always talk, as I said in the book, to his pals, how do you want to die? And he'd go into great detail about it, with arguing with Smathers and his chief of staff. He was always asking those questions when people were riding at home at night. He was always thinking about death and very romantic about it, very poetic about it. I mean, I Have a Rendezvous with Death was his first poem he taught Jackie, and she would read it, she'd recite it to him. And he was always thinking about Raymond Asquith, the young aristocrat who was killed in World War I. He died debonair. That was his word. He died debonair. He marched right into the Somme. It was very romantic about it, almost poetic, and I think he had an Irish attitude about it. And the thing about him is that I just want to leave you on this: the people around him who loved him, his pals loved this guy, and Jackie loved him. There's this great scene at Parkland Hospital here. I just came across it. I was writing a book of this beautiful, thin young woman. She was the same age when he was killed here as he was when he first laid eyes on her.
36.
No, he was 34 when he first met her. 36 when he married her. And she was 34 when he died. He was killed here. And so that 12 years was their age difference. And she was chasing after, it was like Odo and Grecian Urn. I mean, she was in love with this guy. And it comes through all these interviews how much she was in love with the guy and knew him. And the best test of love is she really knew him. And she knew everything we know about him, convinced of that, and loved him. And the theory that Bunny Mellon told me was that a lot of guys came down the road, but this is the guy she loved. She stuck with him. And a lot of it was old world loyalty, but she was as intrigued by him as anybody was. She's trying to figure the guy out. And he was a charmer.
Well, Chris, your book helps us a lot in figuring the guy out. So thank you very much for being here tonight.
It's great to be here. What a great audience. Thank you.
I suggest you all read it.